Lindsay McFly woke up at 6 in the morning as she had done for the past 8 years. Her workday always began the same way: a contrast shower, a cup of strong coffee, and a review of the previous day's sales reports. 5 boutiques in different shopping malls around the city demanded her constant attention. Sid was still asleep, sprawled across his side of the bed. He smelled of stale alcohol. Lindsay grimaced but said nothing. Morning arguments had long since lost their meaning. She got dressed quietly and left the house. Her first stop was the River Mall, where her flagship store was located. Manager Rita was already waiting at the entrance, nervously fiddling with a set of keys. "Good morning, Mrs. McFly. Yesterday was a very successful day. Sales exceeded the target by 20%, and also—" Rita hesitated. "The new collection has arrived, but there's a problem with the sizes." Lindsay nodded. She appreciated Rita's attention to detail and honesty. That was why she had promoted her from sales assistant to store manager 8 months ago. "Show me," Lindsay said, walking inside and taking off her coat. They spent the next hour sorting through the new shipment. Lindsay methodically checked each item against the delivery notes. Her meticulousness often annoyed suppliers, but it was thanks to this approach that she had been able to turn one small shop into a chain of successful boutiques. "Order some more medium sizes. They always sell out first," she instructed, finishing her check. "And count yesterday's cash register. Something about the numbers bothers me." Rita nodded and went to the back room. 15 minutes later she returned, looking noticeably pale. "Mrs. McFly, there's definitely a discrepancy. We're missing $1,200. Lindsay frowned. Shortages were rare. She carefully selected her staff and paid decent wages. "Check the camera footage," she said, trying to sound calm, though she was seething inside. "And call the other managers and tell them to do an unscheduled audit." By lunchtime, it became clear that the money was missing from other stores as well. 3 out of 5 stores had shortages, all of them after the cash had been collected. And the only people with access to the safes were her and— Lindsay took out her phone and opened her banking app. 5 cash withdrawals in the last week. She definitely hadn't made them. "Go home," she said to Rita when she returned. "I'll close the store myself today." She worked in the store all day, helping to advise customers while thinking about the situation. Customers loved it when the owner herself worked in the store. It created a special atmosphere of trust. Lindsay knew many of her regular customers by name and remembered their preferences and sizes. In the evening, as she counted the cash register, she wondered what to do. The total amount missing was close to $5,000, a significant amount of money, but not critical for the business. However, it wasn't about the money. She got home late. Sid wasn't there. Another meeting with potential employers. Lindsay smiled. Over the past month, he had had at least 15 such meetings, but for some reason, he still hadn't found a job. She went into the office and opened the safe. The $1,000 in cash she had put there 3 days ago to pay the supplier was gone. In its place was a note, carelessly written in familiar handwriting. "Sorry, honey, I needed the money for an interview. I'll bring it back on Monday." Lindsay folded the note neatly and put it in her desk drawer. It seemed that the time had come for serious decisions. Sid McFly stood at the glass doors of the office, mechanically adjusting his tie. He had worked for this company for 23 years, starting as a sales manager and working his way up to department head. And now, everything was going downhill. The department reorganization had begun 3 months ago. First, 2 young employees were laid off, then several departments were merged. Sid hoped that his position would remain unchanged. After all, he had so many years of experience and so many clients. But the new management thought differently. "Mr. McFly, please take a seat." Grace Donovan, the new HR director, pointed to a chair. "We greatly appreciate your contribution to the company, but due to optimization—" Sid hardly listened. He stared at the folder of documents in front of him and thought about how he would tell Lindsay. She had always been proud of his career, even though she had been earning much more lately. Compensation equal to 3 months' salary, a letter of recommendation, a corporate retraining program. He mechanically signed the documents and left the office. Everyone in the department already knew. No one looked him in the eye. Only Jim, his deputy and now his new boss, awkwardly tried to say something, but Sid silently walked past him. He had only one box of belongings: family photos, his favorite mug, a few folders with documents. 23 years fit into a cardboard cube. He didn't go home. He wandered around the city, thinking about how to live on. At 52, starting over seemed unrealistic. Lindsay would support him financially, of course. Her shops brought in a good income. But that thought only made him feel worse. By evening, he returned home. Lindsay was at work. She often stayed late. Sid took a bottle of whiskey from the bar, which he had been saving for special occasions. Wasn't this a special occasion? For the first few days, he honestly tried to find a job. He sent out resumes and called old acquaintances. But everywhere he heard the same thing. "Sorry, times are tough right now. Maybe later. We'll be in touch." Lindsay pretended everything was fine. She left money on the table and didn't ask any questions. She just looked at him with a kind of anxious pity that made him want to howl. He started skipping interviews. At first it was accidental. He overslept after a night of whiskey. Then it was deliberate. What was the point if they were going to turn him down anyway? The days merged into a monotonous mass. Wake up at lunchtime, lie on the sofa with his laptop, look for jobs, drink. The money from the company was melting away. Sid tried not to think about it or about the fact that he was increasingly taking bills from his wife's wallet. He would pay her back as soon as he found a job. At some point, he stopped shaving. Then he stopped washing regularly. Why bother? He wasn't going anywhere or seeing anyone. Lindsay tried to talk to him, but he snapped at her. It was easy for her to talk about opportunities and prospects. She had everything going for her. The phone rang less and less often. Old friends drifted away. No one was interested in an unemployed loser. Sid stopped answering calls. He only occasionally corresponded with former colleagues to find out what was going on at the company. The news was not encouraging. The department was thriving under Jim's leadership. One morning, he caught his reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. His face was wrinkled, his stubble was growing, and his eyes were dull. His suits hung in the closet, now looking ridiculous on him. His ties looked like nooses. Lindsay was staying late at work more and more often. Sid understood that she simply didn't want to see him like this. He was disgusted with himself, but he couldn't find the strength to change. His only consolation was a bottle. It didn't judge him, didn't reproach him, didn't look at him with disappointment. It just helped him forget, escape from the reality in which he had become a nobody. It was getting harder and harder to find money for booze. He started selling his things, first his own, then he thought about selling Lindsay's things. But he couldn't bring himself to do it yet. The last remnants of self-respect still lingered somewhere inside him. That evening, when he took the money from the safe for the first time, he felt particularly miserable. Jim sent a message about record sales for the department. 3 job interviews had ended in rejection. Lindsay wasn't answering her phone, probably another important meeting with suppliers. He remembered the code to the safe, their wedding anniversary. He took a little, leaving a note. He was going to return it, honestly. He just needed to get through that evening, and the next one, and the one after that. He couldn't remember when he first walked into Frank's bar, a nondescript dive 3 blocks from his house. No one asked about work or plans for the future there. They just poured, and that was enough. Frank's bar was quiet as usual on a weekday. Sid took his usual spot at the bar and nodded to the bartender. Without asking, he poured a double whiskey. "Frank, add a Coke." A woman's voice to his right made Sid turn his head. Sitting next to him was a woman in her 40s with blonde hair casually pulled back into a ponytail. Her lipstick was slightly smudged and her eyes showed the same fatigue that Sid saw every morning in the mirror. "Hard day?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Hard month? Or year?" Sid shrugged. "I'm Sid. Kayla." She raised her glass. "To crappy days." They started talking. It turned out that Kayla had worked at a travel agency until it went bankrupt 3 months ago. Now she was getting by with odd jobs trying to pay off her loans. "You know what's the worst part?" Kayla leaned closer. "I did everything right. College, career, mortgage, and then, boom, nobody needs you anymore." Sid nodded. He knew that feeling all too well. "The debt collectors call every day," she continued. "They demand that I pay off my debt. Where am I supposed to get that kind of money? I don't have a job and my skills are outdated. I could be a waitress, but that wouldn't pay off the loan." They sat in the bar until closing time. Kaya talked about her life, her problems with the banks, and how she was trying to find a new job. Sid listened, occasionally commenting on his own failures. "Maybe we should go for a walk," Kayla suggested when Frank started wiping down the bar, hinting that it was getting late. They wandered through the night streets, sharing stories from their past. Kayla turned out to be a good listener. She didn't try to give advice or comfort him. She just understood. "Do you know how much I owe the banks?" she asked as they sat down on a park bench. "120,000. Mortgage, car loan, consumer loan for repairs. Everything was fine while I was working. But now—" Sid took out a flask he had grabbed from the bar. Kayla gratefully accepted it. "My wife owns a chain of stores," he admitted after another swig. "Funny, huh? I used to support her and now—" "Does she blame you?" "No, but the way she looks at me, like I'm some kind of loser." "You're not a loser." Kaya put her hand on his shoulder. "Life's just unfair." They met again 2 days later, at the same bar. Then again, and again. Kayla told him about her attempts to find a job, about the calls from the bank, about how she sold her car to pay off part of her debt. Sid caught himself looking forward to these meetings. Kaya was easy to be with. She didn't demand anything, didn't judge, didn't remind him of his failures. She was just there, understanding and supportive. "I've got some whiskey at my place," she said one evening. "Want to continue there? Frank's in a bad mood tonight." Her apartment was small and unkempt. There were letters from the bank and utility bills on the table. Kayla hurriedly put them away in a drawer. "Sorry about the mess. I haven't had time to clean up lately." They settled down on a worn sofa. Kayla took out a bottle and 2 glasses. "What are we drinking to?" "To a new life," she suggested. "It has to start sometime, right?" Sid watched her pour the whiskey and thought that, for the first time in a long time, he felt needed. Kayla didn't compare him to the successful manager he used to be. To her, he was just Sid, a man who understood her problems. He returned home in the early hours of the morning. Lindsay pretended to be asleep, but he knew she had heard everything. It didn't matter to him. The next day, Kayla called him herself. Her voice was trembling. "The bailiffs called. They're threatening to seize our property." "Sid, I don't know what to do." He drove over to her place, taking the money from Lindsay's safe. Kayla met him in tears but grateful. "You're the only one who understands me," she whispered, clinging to him. "The only one who cares about me." The day began with another request. Lindsay was just getting ready for work when Sid appeared in the kitchen, looking rumpled after the previous day. "Honey, I need some money. A great opportunity has come up. An acquaintance is offering me a share in a business." Lindsay silently took out her wallet. She hadn't asked what the money was for in a long time. All she ever got in response were vague explanations about promising projects and business meetings. That evening, she discovered that Sid had taken money from the safe again. This time, he didn't even leave a note. However, she was already used to it. It had happened at least 10 times in the last month. The next day, history repeated itself. Lindsay, there's this thing. I need to meet with some partners to discuss details. She knew there were no partners. It was just another drinking binge. Sid was home, less and less. Sometimes he would call in the early morning, his voice slurred with a woman's laughter in the background. I'm at a friend's place, don't worry. What friend? In 20 years of marriage, she knew all his friends. Once she woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the door opening. She heard footsteps and muffled voices coming from the hallway. Quiet, you'll wake her up, a hoarse female whisper said. Wait, I'll just grab my documents, Sid's voice said. Then footsteps again, the sound of the door closing. In the morning, she discovered that Sid's suit and several shirts were missing from the closet. His shaving kit was gone from the bathroom. They almost stopped talking. Sid came home as a guest, to pick something up, get money, change clothes. He was always in a hurry, always finding reasons not to stay. I need to go to another city, a possible job, was another lie. In fact, he was living with a woman in a neighboring neighborhood. Lindsay knew. She had seen them together at the supermarket. Sid pretended not to notice her. Money was flowing out like water. Sid was no longer just taking, he was demanding. This is still my house, and so is my money. She silently took out her wallet, thinking it was time to change the locks. One evening, he showed up with an unfamiliar woman. They were drunk and didn't even try to hide it. We need to take something, Sid said, heading for the bedroom. The woman stayed in the hallway, looking at the photos on the walls. Nice house, she said with a smirk. Cozy? Lindsay said nothing. She watched as Sid carried his things out and carelessly stuffed them into a sports bag. The woman, obviously his mistress, helped him, glancing at her from time to time. Lindsay didn't sleep that night. She sat in her office sorting through documents. Bank statements showed how much money had been drained over the past few months. Sid wasn't just taking money anymore. He was robbing her family. In the morning, she called her lawyer. I need advice, urgently. An hour later, she was sitting in a spacious office explaining the situation. The lawyer listened attentively, taking notes. So he hasn't been working for 6 months? And he's been living off your money? And now he has a mistress? Lindsay nodded. Well, it's an unpleasant situation, but it can be resolved. I have an idea. That evening, Sid came back for the money. This time, Lindsay was ready. She listened calmly to his rambling explanations about urgent needs and the last time. Watching him hastily count the bills, she thought that today really was the last time. Tomorrow, she would take action. Attorney Tony Walsh had specialized in divorce cases for over 15 years. His office on the 23rd floor of a business center was decorated with understated elegance, dark wood, leather chairs, panoramic windows overlooking the city. So he's unemployed, living off your money, has a mistress, Walsh said, sorting through the documents Lindsay had brought him. And he can claim half of your assets, including the business you built from scratch. That's right, Lindsay said, adjusting her blouse collar. I want to know all my options. Walsh leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen on the table. There are several ways. The standard one is a long divorce process with a division of property. Given his behavior, we can try to prove extravagance, but that will take time. The second option is an amicable agreement, but judging by what you've told me, he's unlikely to agree to a compromise. Any non-standard options? The lawyer paused, studying his client. Then he leaned forward. There is one way. It's not exactly traditional, but it's effective. They spent the next hour discussing the details. Lindsay listened attentively, occasionally taking notes in her notebook. The main thing is to get all the paperwork right, Walsh said, taking out his business card. I have a doctor I know who can help with the medical side of things. It won't be cheap, but it'll be worth it. The next day, Lindsay was sitting in Dr. Miles's office. A gray-haired man with an attentive gaze studied her medical records. "So we need to file for disability," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "This is a serious step. Do you understand the consequences?" Lindsay nodded. "Completely. You'll need to undergo several examinations for authenticity and prepare a proper medical history." The next 2 weeks turned into an endless series of doctor's appointments, filling out paperwork and gathering references. Lindsay methodically followed all of Walsh's recommendations while continuing to run the business and pretending that nothing was happening. Sid came home less and less often. Sometimes she heard him coming home in the early hours of the morning to pick up some of his things or take money. Now she deliberately left small amounts of cash lying around for him to take. Each instance was documented and added to the growing folder of evidence. "All the documents are ready." Dr. Miles handed her a heavy folder. "Medical history, test results, commission report. Everything is in order." Lindsay leafed through the papers. The diagnosis sounded convincing. All the stamps were in place. "Now we need to file the documents with the appropriate authorities." Walsh arranged the papers in the correct order. "It will take time, but the result is guaranteed. When the divorce proceedings begin, we will have a serious trump card." That evening, sitting in her office, Lindsay looked through all the documents again. The plan was risky, but carefully thought out. Now all that remained was to wait for the right moment. There was a knock at the door. Sid stood in the doorway, rumpled but relatively sober. "I need money," he said without even saying hello. "Right now." Lindsay silently took out the amount she had prepared in advance. Sid grabbed the money and disappeared without even saying goodbye. The courtroom was half full. Lindsay sat next to Walsh looking through the documents. On the opposite side sat Sid with his lawyer, a young, confident attorney named Baker. Right behind them sat Kaya, demonstratively placing her hand on Sid's shoulder. The judge, an elderly woman with an attentive gaze, studied the case files. Lindsay noticed her frown when she reached the financial documents. "This is the case for the dissolution of the marriage between Sid and Lindsay McFly." The judge's voice sounded even and professional. "According to the documents presented, the property to be divided includes—" Lindsay listened half-heartedly. She looked at Sid. For the first time in weeks, he was sober and dressed decently. Apparently, the lawyer had insisted. 5 retail outlets located in shopping malls in the city, with a total value of— Kaya fidgeted in her seat. Lindsay saw her whisper something in Sid's ear and nervously fiddle with the strap of her purse. "Mr. McFly is claiming half of the business, claiming that he participated in its development." Baker rose from his seat. "My client is prepared to provide evidence." "Objection." Walsh smiled slightly. "We have documents confirming that the business was created and developed exclusively with Mrs. McFly's funds. Furthermore—" He took out a folder with disability documents. Lindsay noticed how tense Sid had become. "According to the medical report, my client has a confirmed disability. In such a situation, the law provides for special conditions for the division of property as well as mandatory payments from the spouse." Silence fell over the courtroom. Sid looked at his ex-wife in confusion, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. "That's a lie." Kaya jumped up from her seat. "She set this up. Sid, don't let her do it." Silence in the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. "Or I will remove the disruptors." The hearing continued. Walsh methodically presented documents, medical reports, financial statements, evidence of Sid's extravagance. Baker tried to object, but his arguments sounded less and less convincing. During the break, Lindsay went out into the hallway. She heard quick footsteps behind her, but didn't have time to turn around. "You!" Kayla grabbed her by the hair. You think you're so smart? Everything will be mine, you hear me? Mine. Lindsay didn't even try to resist. She just stood there while security dragged the enraged woman away. This incident will be recorded, Walsh said calmly, appearing with a camera in his hands. Threats and assault against a person with a disability are serious aggravating circumstances. After the break, Caillou was not allowed into the courtroom. Sid sat dejected, avoiding looking at Lindsay. Considering all the documents presented, the judge said slowly and solemnly, and taking into account the plaintiff's state of health, the court rules. Lindsay listened to the decision with an impassive expression. Everything was going according to plan. She would keep the business and Sid would have to pay alimony to support her. This is unfair. Sid jumped to his feet. She set this up. I demand a second medical examination. Mr. McFly, the judge looked at him over her glasses. One more violation of court order and I will add a fine for contempt of court to the decision. As she left the courtroom, Lindsay heard Kaya shouting in the hallway. We won't leave it at that. You hear me? You'll be sorry. She didn't turn around. It was all over. Sid sat in the kitchen of his rented apartment and stared at the bottle of whiskey. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like drinking. In front of him lay the court decision, 10 pages that had crossed out his entire future. Kaya paced around the room saying something about injustice and intrigue, but he didn't listen. Numbers were spinning in his head. Alimony for his disabled wife exceeded his last salary when he was still working. Are you just going to sit there? Kaya stopped in front of him. You have to do something. You have rights. What rights? He looked at her with a cloudy gaze. Have you seen the documents? Everything is legal. Legal? She snorted. That bitch fixed everything. She bought the papers, made deals with the doctors. We need to hire a private investigator, find evidence. With what money, Kaya? Sid looked at her soberly for the first time in a long time. I have nothing left. Nothing at all. He looked around the apartment, small, unkempt, with scattered belongings and empty bottles. The last few months had flown by in a fog. He had squandered Lindsay's money, made plans for the future with Kayla, dreamed of getting half of his wife's business. You had some savings. Kayla sat down next to him and put her hand on his shoulder. Or we could borrow some. I know a couple of people. Enough. He shook her hand away. No more debts. No more adventures. For the first time in a long time, he saw the situation clearly. A smart, successful wife who had put up with his antics for years, his own degradation from a successful manager to an alcoholic, and Kayla, a woman with a pile of debts who saw him as a chance to make easy money. The next day, Kayla tried to act on her own. She waited for Lindsay outside a store, trying to talk to her. Security guards escorted her away, threatening to call the police. That bitch wouldn't even listen to me, she complained that evening. She walks around like she's the queen, but we can ruin her life, like spread rumors about her fake documents. And get sued for defamation, Sid said, rubbing his face wearily. She's got it all figured out, can't you see? A week passed. Kayla didn't give up trying to get to Lindsay. She wrote angry posts on social media, tried to turn suppliers against her, and even found some shady guy who promised to put some pressure on her like a man. Lindsay ignored everything. Her business was thriving, her stores were open, and attempts to pressure her were met with ironclad legal protection. Maybe we should try talking to her normally, Sid suggested one day. Apologize, explain the situation. Apologize, Kaya laughed, to that hypocrite. She set the whole thing up. I bet she's been planning it for a long time, waiting for the right moment. Sid was silent. He remembered how Lindsay had silently endured his drinking, given him money, and never thrown a tantrum. And he had considered it weakness, thinking he could live off her forever. Kayla continued to make plans for revenge. She talked about compromising information, about some connections at the tax office, about friends who were ready to take care of the problem. But Sid wasn't listening anymore. He searched the internet for job openings and addresses of clinics that treated alcoholism. A month later, he packed his things and left. Kayla yelled after him, promising she would make him regret it, threatening to tell everyone what a traitor he was. He walked down the street with a single bag containing his entire life and thought about how, for the first time in a long time, he had made the right decision. That same evening, he sent Lindsay a short message. "I'm sorry. You were right." He didn't expect a reply. The official documents arrived 2 weeks after the hearing. Sid received a thick envelope with a court seal and opened it right there at the post office. The writ of execution ordered monthly payments of 40% of any income to his ex-wife. On the same day, the bailiff called, introduced himself curtly, and explained the procedure. If Sid got a job, the funds would be deducted automatically. If not, the debt would accumulate and his property would be seized. What property? Sid snorted into the phone. He lived in a cheap rented room on the outskirts of town, ate instant noodles, and his only valuable possession was an old laptop. However, he had to look for work. He sent out dozens of resumes, went to several interviews, but was rejected everywhere. At his age, with no work experience in the last year, his chances were slim. Unexpectedly, he got lucky. An old colleague recommended him to a small company. Sid spent 3 days preparing for the interview. He bought a decent suit at a thrift store, got a haircut, and learned everything he could about his potential employer. The meeting went well. The sales manager, a portly, good-natured man, was clearly impressed by his experience. They discussed strategies for working with clients, reminisced about mutual acquaintances in the market, and even joked about golf. "Well, Mr. McFly," the manager extended his hand, "I think we're ready to offer you the position. All that's left is to settle the formalities with HR." Sid left the office feeling elated. For the first time in a long time, he had hope that he could start over. The next day, the HR manager called, a dry woman with an unpleasant voice. "Mr. McFly, I'm sorry, but we have to withdraw the offer," she said without a hint of regret. "Our check revealed that you owe child support. This is against company policy." He tried to explain the situation, asked for a chance, promised to pay the debt out of his salary. But the decision was final. In the evening, the bailiff called. He said that the debt was growing and asked when Sid planned to start making payments. "How can I pay when no one will hire me because of this child support?" Sid exploded. "That's not our problem," the bailiff replied indifferently. "The law is the law." He sat in his room, staring at the writ of execution. The amount stated in the document seemed astronomical. In his current situation, it was impossible to pay it. Meanwhile, Lindsay was thriving. He happened to see an article about her in the local newspaper, a photo of a smiling businesswoman and an interview about the successful development of a chain of clothing stores. Not a word about the divorce or personal problems. The phone was ringing off the hook with calls from debt collectors. They threatened him, demanded immediate payment, and promised trouble. Sid stopped answering the phone. He tried to find work as a loader or courier, but everywhere he went they asked for documents. As soon as they found out about the alimony, they turned him down. It was a vicious circle. One morning he saw an envelope from another bailiff on the table. Inside was a notice of enforcement proceedings and a warning about possible restrictions on travel abroad. "Where am I going to go?" Sid smiled wryly, crumpling the paper. He didn't even have enough money for a ticket to the next town. He took out a half-empty bottle of whiskey but stopped himself. No more alcohol. He had to make a decision. Maybe he should try starting his own business, or move to another city, or... The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. A courier was standing on the doorstep with another envelope. "Sid McFly, you have a court summons." Lindsay always arrived at the office at 8 in the morning. Her workday began with reviewing reports from all 5 stores. The numbers were encouraging. After her divorce, she had thrown herself into her work, and it was paying off. Rita, her best manager, came in with a cup of coffee and the latest sales figures. Last month, we exceeded our target by 30%. The new collection is doing great, especially at the Riverside Shopping Center. Lindsay nodded as she looked through the documents. After everything that had happened, she had carried out a small reorganization, changed suppliers, updated the product range, and focused on a younger audience. The risk had paid off. On the other side of town, Sid woke up in his rented room. He had finally found a job at a small auto repair shop that paid cash and didn't require any documents. The position was called administrator, but in reality he was a handyman, an accountant, and a mechanic. The pay was meager, but he had no choice. He gave half of it for his room and tried to live on the rest. His alimony debt was growing like a snowball. Kaya showed up unexpectedly, calling in the middle of the day from an unfamiliar number. "Hey, loser," her voice sounded sarcastic. "How's life at the bottom?" He listened to her drunken ramblings in silence. It turned out she was trying to find a new sponsor, but without success. Her creditors were closing in, and she had to sell her apartment to pay off her debts. "Did you know your ex is opening her 6th store?" Kayla spoke louder and louder. "I saw the ad in the most prestigious shopping center, and you and I could have been co-owners of all this." Sid hung up. He had indeed seen the advertisement for Lindsay's new store. He passed the construction site every day on his way to work. Meanwhile, in Lindsay's office, a meeting was underway to discuss the opening of the new location. Designers presented their plans. Managers discussed purchases and staffing. "We have to be ready for the start of the season," Lindsay wrote in her diary. "Rita, will you take care of hiring the team?" Her business was growing. She felt free. For the first time in years, she didn't have to look back at her husband, his problems, and his demands. All decisions were made quickly and easily. Kaya continued to call Sid, sometimes in tears and begging for help, sometimes threatening him. Once she waited for him at the car repair shop. "Look at yourself," she said, waving her arms drunkenly. "You've become a regular workhorse. You could have lived like a human being. We could have—" "Go away," he said, without even turning toward her. "Just go away." She shouted something after him, but he didn't listen. That evening he had to ask the owner of the garage to change the locks. Kayla had threatened to trash the place. Lindsay sometimes saw her ex-husband. The city wasn't that big. He had aged considerably, become gaunt, and now dressed very simply. But he held himself straight and no longer smelled of alcohol. Once they bumped into each other at the supermarket. Sid was buying instant noodles and cheap tea. Lindsay was choosing wine for a business meeting. "Hello," he nodded at her like a stranger. "Hello," she replied in the same tone. No more words were needed. Kaya eventually left town. Rumor had it that she had found another lonely man with money somewhere on the coast. Sid hoped he would never hear from her again. Lindsay continued to build her business. She had plans to expand into neighboring cities and was in preliminary negotiations with major brands. "Mrs. McFly," Rita brought the documents for her to sign. "The suppliers have agreed to our terms. Shall we sign the contract?" Lindsay smiled. Life went on, now on her own terms. A cheap bar on the outskirts of town was packed with workers from nearby construction sites and factories. Sid sat in the far corner sipping watered-down beer. He hadn't planned on going back to drinking, but his last encounter with the bailiff had thrown him off track. His debt was growing like a snowball. His job at the auto repair shop barely allowed him to make ends meet, and paying child support was out of the question. The debt collectors called every day, threatening court action and seizure of property. At the next table, 3 men in work clothes were arguing loudly. "I'm telling you, you made a mistake," said a large bearded man. "Yes, the conditions are tough, but the pay is good. You can save up for an apartment in 6 months. Yeah, if you survive, his companion grunted. I've heard it's 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Freezing cold, mosquitoes the size of sparrows. You live in a trailer, no internet, no phone reception. But you get $50,000 a month. The bearded man banged his mug on the table. Net. And it's all official with a contract. Half goes straight to your card, half at the end of the shift. Sid looked up. 50,000? With that kind of money, he could start paying off his alimony debt. Where would I go? Asked the third man. North. They're laying a gas pipeline there and need workers. They'll take anyone. Welders, fitters, handymen. The main thing is that you're healthy and willing to work. Sid finished his beer and headed decisively toward their table. Excuse me, he said, stopping next to the bearded man. I overheard your conversation. Can you give me their contact details? The men stared at him in surprise. In his worn jacket and worn-out shoes, he didn't look like a typical shift worker. And who are you? The bearded man looked him up and down. Sid, I work as an administrator at a car service, but I need money. Badly. Take a seat, the bearded man said, moving over. My name is Mickey. I worked there for 3 years. I know everything there is to know. For the next hour, Sid listened to stories about working on a construction site in the north. The conditions were indeed harsh, living in a construction camp, minimal amenities, and a difficult schedule. But the pay was good and on time. Here, Mickey wrote a phone number on a napkin. Call tomorrow morning and ask for Stevens. Tell him I sent you. Sid clutched the napkin in his pocket. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. What documents do you need? He asked, remembering the writ of execution. Passport, medical certificate, certificate of no criminal record, and your employment record if you have one. They don't ask about alimony? Mickey chuckled. They don't care about that. The main thing is to work. Back in his room, Sid stared at the phone number for a long time. 6 months in the middle of nowhere, hard physical labor, no contact with the outside world. But this was his chance to get out of the hole he was in. He took out his phone and saved the number. He would call in the morning. Sid dialed the number at exactly 9 in the morning. The phone was picked up after the second ring. This is Stevens. The voice was hoarse and businesslike. Good morning. Mickey gave me your number. About the job up north. Oh, from old Mickey? The voice warmed. What can you do? Sid hesitated. 20 years in an office wasn't going to help him on a construction site. To be honest, I don't have much experience with physical labor, but I'm willing to learn, and I really need the money. There was a pause on the other end. All right, tomorrow at 10, we'll have an interview. I'll text you the address. Bring your passport and medical records if you have them. The company's office was located in an industrial area, a gray building with no identifying signs. Inside, it smelled of coffee and fresh paint. Stevens turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 60s with a military bearing. He glanced at the documents and got straight to the point. The conditions are as follows. A 6-month contract, 2 shifts, accommodation in a workers' village. Pay is $5,000 a day plus a bonus at the end of the contract. 30% up front, the rest at the end of the shift. Sid quickly calculated in his head. In 6 months, he could earn more than he had in 2 years at the car repair shop. When do I start? The group leaves in 3 days. Will you have time to get ready? There wasn't much to pack. A couple of changes of clothes, toiletries, an old phone. Sid told his landlady he was moving out and paid the car repair shop. On the appointed day, he arrived at the company office. Workers with large bags were already crowding at the entrance. About 30 people of different ages. 2 buses were waiting with their engines running. Okay, newbie, Stevens handed him a thick folder. Here's your contract, instructions, and safety rules. Read them on the bus. We'll be there in about 12 hours. Sid sat down by the window and opened the documents. He had some tough months ahead of him, but he felt strangely relieved. It was as if he had finally found a way out of his dead end. The bus started moving. The city slowly disappeared into the morning fog. Somewhere out there were his old life, his debts, his problems. Sid took out his phone, wanting to text Lindsay that he had found a job and would start paying child support. But he changed his mind. First, he had to prove himself. "First time on duty?" asked his neighbor, a stocky man with a weather-beaten face. "Yes, it's a little scary." "It'll be fine," the man said, holding out his hand. "Jim." Sid shook his hand. The suburbs flashed by outside the window, and ahead lay a long road to the north. A new life was beginning to the steady hum of the engine and the quiet conversations of his fellow passengers. The workers' village greeted them with a piercing wind and endless rows of identical trailers. The foreman, a tall man named Chuck, quickly assigned the newcomers to their places. "You're with Jim in the third trailer," he said to Sid. "Get up at 6 tomorrow. Shift starts at 7. Showers are at the end of the row. The mess hall is there too." The trailer was cramped but clean. There were 2 narrow beds, a wardrobe, a table, and an electric kettle. Jim quickly unpacked his things, humming to himself. Sid's first day of work was difficult. Unaccustomed to physical labor, his arms ached and his back refused to straighten. He carried pipes, dug trenches, and helped the welders. "Not bad for your first day," Jim said approvingly in the evening. "But this is just the beginning. Wait until the frost hits." By the end of the week, Sid had settled in. His body was gradually getting used to the strain, and his appetite was returning. Only in the evenings did a feeling of melancholy roll over him, and a wild desire to drink. "I know what you're thinking," Jim said, handing him a mug of strong tea. "It's the same for everyone at first, but they're strict about it here. If you get caught drinking, you're out in a flash, and the penalty clause in the contract will leave your mother crying." They often talked in the evenings. Jim turned out to be an interesting conversationalist. He had years of experience working all over the country, lots of stories and encounters. "What brought you here?" he asked one day. "You don't look like a hard worker." Sid paused, then told him about his divorce, alimony, and debts. Jim listened without interrupting. "You know, buddy," he said after a pause, "you did the right thing coming here. It's hard, but it's honest work, and the money is real." Days turned into weeks. Sid fell into a rhythm: work, sleep, work again. Thoughts of drinking receded, replaced by fatigue and new experiences. On weekends, he and Jim sometimes went fishing, the only entertainment available. Jim taught him how to hold a rod properly, choose a spot, and prepare bait. "The main thing is patience," he said. "Just like in life, there's no need to rush. Everything will come in its own time." Money trickled in on his card. Not much, but regularly. Sid sent it all to the bailiff, keeping almost nothing for himself. Slowly but surely, the debt was decreasing. One evening, there was a knock on the door of their trailer. Standing on the threshold was a newcomer, a young guy with a bottle of whiskey under his jacket. "Hey guys, how about we celebrate getting to know each other?" Sid felt his insides tighten with the desire to drink, but Jim was already showing the guy out. "Get out of here before the foreman finds out," he said harshly, "and throw that bottle away. There's no place for that here." Later, over tea, Jim told him how he himself had once almost broken down on duty. "You know what saved me? I realized that this was my last chance. Either I made it or it was all over. So think about why you came here." Sid nodded. He took out a crumpled photograph, the only thing he had taken from his past life. In it, he and Lindsay were young and happy. "I can't fix everything," he said quietly, "but at least I can pay back my debt. I have to." Jim patted him silently on the shoulder. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the distance, trucks carrying pipes roared. Another night shift was beginning. "So you're staying?" Jim sat on the porch of the trailer puffing on his pipe. The shift was coming to an end, and the workers were gathering their things and discussing their plans for the weekend. "Yes, I made a deal with Stevens," Sid said, sitting down next to him. "He offered me a foreman's job at the new site. He said I did a good job. In 6 months he had really settled in. He had learned how to operate the equipment, read blueprints, and organize the work. The hard physical labor no longer scared him. His body had grown stronger and his hands had become accustomed to the tools." "You're a smart guy," Jim knocked out the pipe. "How much do you have left to pay off?" "According to my calculations, the second shift should cover the debt." He methodically sent money to the bailiff every month, leaving himself the minimum for food and necessities. The debt was melting away, but it was still impressive. The usual morning bustle reigned in Lindsay's office. Rita was sorting documents and the secretary was sorting the mail. "Mrs. McFly, you have a letter from the bailiff," she said, placing an official envelope on the table. Lindsay opened it without much interest. She hadn't followed her ex-husband's case for a long time. Inside was a notice of another payment. She glanced at the numbers and frowned. The amount was significant, much more than she could earn at a car repair shop or as a courier. "Strange," she muttered, opening the payment history. Over the past 6 months, payments had been coming in regularly, in large amounts. Meanwhile, in the north, a new shift was beginning. Sid was taking over a crew of 20 people, half of whom were newbies. "The rules are simple," he said, looking over the men. "Work hard, no drinking, follow safety procedures. Any questions?" In the evening, as usual, he sent the money. The alert system on Lindsay's phone rang, notifying her of a new payment. "What's going on?" She opened the file with the total amount owed. The numbers were rapidly decreasing. Months passed. Sid settled into his role as foreman. Under his leadership, the work went smoothly and efficiently. Stevens often held up his team as an example to others. "Well done," Jim would say when he stopped by. He worked on the next block. "You've made a great leader." One morning, Lindsay found an unusual letter in the mail. It was a notice that her child support debt had been paid in full. She read the document several times. In a year and a half, Sid had not only paid the current payments, he had paid off the entire debt. Where did he get the money? That evening, she tried to find information about her ex-husband. His old phone was silent, and he no longer lived at his old address. It was as if he had disappeared. In the north, the last day of the shift was coming to an end. Sid stood on a hill, watching the sun set. Somewhere in the distance, machinery rumbled as the village prepared for the shift change. "Are you free?" Jim handed him a printout of his bank account. "Looks like it," Sid smiled. "Tomorrow is the last transfer, and then it's all over." "What next?" "Home. Time to start a new life." In the city, Lindsay was thoughtfully sorting through old photos. In one of them, she and Sid were very young. He was wearing a suit. She was in a summer dress. It seemed like a different life. She took out her phone, wanting to write a message. But what? "Thanks for being honest. Glad you made it?" In the end, she just put her phone down. Everything in its own time. The northern winter changed people. Sid didn't notice it right away. First in others, then in himself. The constant wind whipped his skin. The cold taught him to think quickly and work precisely. Here, you couldn't afford to hesitate or make mistakes. Every morning, washing his face with ice-cold water, he saw a new face in the mirror. His skin had become rough, his wrinkles deeper, but there was a new seriousness in his eyes. He used to deliberately grow a small belly, thinking that was what a respectable manager should look like. Now his body was made up of hard muscles and tendons. The job of foreman required a different way of thinking. No more long deliberations and endless meetings, only quick, clear decisions. If equipment broke down, a solution had to be found immediately. If there was a conflict in the team, it had to be resolved immediately before it escalated. The old Sid loved long, flowery speeches. The new Sid spoke briefly and to the point. Peterson, get some people and check the fastenings. Johnson, take the equipment inside, it's going to freeze tonight. Every word carried weight. Every decision had consequences. He learned to read people, to see when someone was so tired that they were likely to make a mistake, to understand who needed support and who needed to be kept on a tight leash. The team became a living organism to him, where everyone played their part. Jim often dropped by in the evenings to bring news from other sites. "You know what they say about you?" he asked one day. "Iron Sid. They say that if he takes on a job, you don't need to check up on him, it'll be done right." Sid just smiled. He remembered how his hands trembled in the early days from the unfamiliar work, how his whole body ached, how he wanted to give up and run away. Now he was teaching the newbies himself. The main thing is not to rush. Do it slowly but correctly. Speed will come later. Are you cold? Move more. You can't stand still here. Keep an eye on your partner. You won't survive alone in these parts. Old habits died off like frost-bitten skin. He forgot the taste of expensive whiskey. Now he only drank strong tea. He forgot how to wear suits. His body got used to rough work clothes. He even started talking differently, as if those years in the office had never happened. At night, when the wind howled particularly loudly, he sometimes thought about the past. He remembered how he had asked his wife for money, how he had lied about job interviews, how he had drunk away his last money with Kay. Now, these memories only caused him bewilderment. How could he have been so weak? One day, some bigwigs from the head office came to the village for some important negotiations. Sid gave them a tour of the facility. One of the managers, noticing his confident manner, asked, "Did you used to be a manager?" "Yes," Sid replied, "but that was in a different life." He wasn't being disingenuous. That slick manager in his expensive suit was indeed far away, like a character in an old movie. Now, he knew exactly what he was worth, what he was capable of, and what he was responsible for. In the evening after work, he sat with Jim by the stove. Outside, a blizzard was raging, and the thermometer read -40. "You know," Jim said suddenly, "I've seen a lot of people here. Some break down, others survive. But you're the first one who's really changed." Sid said nothing. He looked at his hands, large, calloused, with machine grease ingrained in the skin. The hands of a man who had finally found himself. The city greeted him with unfamiliar hustle and bustle and stuffiness. After the wide open spaces of the north, the streets seemed cramped, the people too loud and busy. Sid walked through familiar places, looking at the changes that had taken place over the past year and a half. He settled in a small hotel on the outskirts temporarily until he found an apartment. In the morning, he was going to meet with Stevens to discuss a new project, the construction of a shopping center. The company had appreciated his work in the north and offered him the position of project manager. The small coffee shop on the corner was not very crowded. Sid sat down by the window and ordered a strong black coffee, a habit he had picked up in the north. He was looking through the project documents when the doorbell rang, letting in new customers. Lindsay walked in, giving orders on her phone. She hadn't changed much. The same perfect hairstyle, the same strict suit, the same confident movements. She sat down at the next table without even glancing in his direction. "Double cappuccino and tuna salad," she said to the waitress in a familiar tone. Sid watched her over the top of his documents. It was strange to see her so close after so many months. It was like a scene from an old movie in the middle of a new series. Lindsay was looking for something in her purse, frowning and tapping her fingers on the table. Finally, she took out a flash drive and turned it over in her hands. "Excuse me," she turned to him. "Do you have a phone charger? Mine is dead and I have an important call in 5 minutes." He silently handed her his cable. She nodded gratefully, not recognizing him. How could she? Instead of the slick manager, she was looking at a strong man with a weathered face and an attentive gaze. "Have you been in town long?" she asked politely, plugging in her phone. "I don't think I've seen you before." "I got back yesterday. I was up north." "Oh, construction. I hear they've got some big projects going on there." "Yeah, laying a pipeline." He took a sip of coffee. "Hi, Lindsay." She froze with the cup halfway to her mouth. She stared at his face and blinked. "Sid?" He nodded. There was a pause filled with the clinking of dishes and soft music. You've changed." She continued to stare at him as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "The North changes people." "So that's where the transfers were from," she said, setting her untouched coffee aside. "I didn't know. It was my job to pay back the debt." They talked for another hour. He told her about life in the workers' village, about his first months there, about how he became a foreman. She listened intently, asking questions from time to time. "And now?" she finally asked. "I'm going to build here. The company offered me a good project." She looked at his hands, strong with calluses, holding the cup confidently. At his straight back, his shoulders squared. At his calm, steady gaze. "You know," she said, standing up, "I'm glad that everything is like this." He understood what she meant. Not everything is good or everything has worked out. Just everything is as it should be. "Good luck with your new project," she said, fastening her purse. "And thank you for your honesty." He watched her leave. The bell rang again in the coffee shop, letting in new customers. The city was going about its business, but now Sid felt like he belonged there. It had been a tough day at the construction site. 2 cranes had broken down, suppliers had missed deadlines for metal structures, and workers were grumbling about delayed wages. Sid had been rushing between sites since morning, trying to patch up all the holes at once. By evening, he finally got to the paperwork. The accounting department wanted reports, and the bank wanted confirmation that the loan was being used for its intended purpose. He was sitting in his trailer office when a security guard knocked on the door. "Boss, there's a visitor for you. A woman." Lindsay stood at the construction site gate, holding a cardboard container with 2 cups of coffee. In her immaculate suit and high heels, she looked completely out of place here, like an exotic bird among the piles of construction debris and roaring machinery. "I was driving by," she said, handing him one of the cups. "I thought I'd bring you some coffee. You still drink it black, right?" Sid mechanically took the cup. After a hard day saturated with the smells of diesel fuel and concrete dust, he felt particularly awkward next to her. Just like in the early days on the construction site. Workers gathered at a distance, curiously glancing at the unusual scene. Their boss, usually confident and tough, was clearly embarrassed in front of the elegant lady. "So, this is the type of man you prefer now?" He smiled grimly, running his hand over his weather-beaten face. "A workhorse with dirt under his fingernails and a worn-out overcoat?" There was a lingering bitterness in his voice, not resentment, but rather self-irony. He stood towering over her, broad-shouldered, sinewy, his hands cracked from the cold and wind. Lindsay looked at him closely, without the former condescension or pity, just calm and serious. She saw how not only his appearance had changed, but also his gaze, his posture, his manner of holding himself. "My type of man is someone who commands respect," she said evenly. "After a long time, you fit that type." She turned and walked to her car, leaving him to digest her words. Her heels sank awkwardly into the construction dirt, but she walked confidently without losing her dignity. Sid watched her go, holding his cooling coffee in his hand. Somewhere above, a crane blared demandingly, bringing him back to reality. He still had to sort out the delayed pay, check the equipment repairs, and finish his reports. He put the cup on the table in the trailer and picked up the papers. But her words still echoed in his head, mingling with the noise of the construction site and the hum of the machines. Half an hour later, the foreman came running in. There were problems with the foundation on the south side. Sid put the documents aside and went to sort things out. Work couldn't wait, and he was now a man who kept his promises. Lindsay started bringing coffee once a week. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. She was passing by. She was in the area. Then it became a habit. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, whenever she had time between meetings and errands. She always had a busy schedule, but she always found time for coffee. Sid noticed that he had started checking his watch on the days she usually came by. If she was late, it meant traffic or an important meeting with suppliers. If she arrived early, she had managed to slip out between meetings. He never asked her why she did it. She never explained. They talked about work. Her chain of stores was expanding, new locations were opening. His construction project was in full swing despite all the difficulties with supplies and the weather. Sometimes they discussed city news, changes in old neighborhoods, new projects, no personal topics, no memories of the past. Just 2 cups of coffee and a leisurely conversation at the gate of the construction site. The workers had already gotten used to her visits. An elegant woman in an expensive suit bringing her boss coffee had become part of the landscape. They even started cleaning up the area around the gate to make it easier for her to pass. That evening, it was drizzling. Lindsay arrived later than usual. Some paperwork had delayed her at the office. They took shelter in his trailer, which served as an office. Sid turned on the heater. October was turning out to be a damp month. "How's the apartment search going?" she asked, warming her hands on a cardboard cup of coffee. Raindrops glistened in her hair. "Not good," Sid shrugged wearily. "Everything's wrong. Either the neighborhood's inconvenient or the price is astronomical. I liked one, but the landlord changed his mind at the last minute. I'm staying at a hotel for now." He didn't add that he spent most of his time at the construction site anyway. He left before dawn and came back after midnight. What difference did it make where he slept for those few hours? "You know," she paused, thoughtfully examining the contents of her glass as if she could find the right words there. "Your side of the closet in the bedroom is still empty." Sid froze with his coffee half finished. Outside the window, the construction site was buzzing. Even in this weather, work didn't stop. Somewhere in the distance, a late dump truck honked and movers cursed. But in the trailer there was absolute silence, broken only by the sound of raindrops hitting the roof. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, feeling his throat go dry. She nodded silently, without looking up. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clenched the glass. "I snore now," he said, the first thing that came to mind. "And I get up at 5 in the morning, and my hands will never be clean again. So much ingrained dirt, fuel oil, concrete dust. You can't wash it off." "I know," she finally looked at him. There was no pity or condescension in her gaze, only calm confidence. "I know everything." He slowly put down the glass. On the table lay blueprints, estimates, contracts, his whole new life, laid out in folders. A life he had built himself just as he was now building this shopping center. Sweat, blood, and sleepless nights turned into concrete and metal. "Give me until the end of the week," he said, looking at the blueprints. "I need to finish this stage of the work. Submit the documents. Check the deliveries." She smiled and stood up. She smelled of expensive perfume, a subtle scent, almost imperceptible amid the smell of construction, rain, and coffee. "The keys are where they always are," she said, heading for the door. "In the vase on the dresser." The rain intensified, but Sid stood by the trailer for a long time watching her car drive away. The red taillights disappeared into the gray veil of rain. He took out his phone and dialed a number. "Jim? Remember how you said that sometimes you have to go back to start over? I think I understand what you meant. Somewhere deep in the construction site, an engine roared. The night shift was starting. Sid put his phone away and went to check on the work. He had 1 week left to finish an important stage of his life and start a new one.